On a crisp October morning, Eli Walker sipped black coffee on his porch, staring across the golden fields his family had defended for 120 years. The mug fit snug in his weathered hands, steam curling up to meet the sharp air that hinted winter wasn't too far behind. The old rocking chair creaked gently beneath him, the same one his father had whittled back when the world still seemed simple. Across the front yard, the fields rolled out in golden waves stubborn against the slow creep of time. Somewhere inside the house, the radio played low, crackling a familiar country tune through the static. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. Echoes of his grandfather's words stirred in his mind. Land's not just dirt, it's memory. Every fence post, every patch of stubborn mesquite, every worn cattle path told a story only he and the old-timers still remembered. He drained the last of his coffee and set the mug on the porch rail. The air carried the scent of dry hay and the faint sharpness of cedar. In the distance, a crow cawed, slicing through the morning stillness. Eli rose, stretching his back with a grunt, and dusted off his jeans. It was Wednesday, which meant breakfast at Margie's diner and maybe a quick word with the fellas about the water co-op vote coming up. Sagebrush Hollow might have been small, but it was still stubborn about its routines. He saddled up his old pickup and made the slow drive into town, tires crunching on the gravel roads that twisted between parched fields and lone mesquite trees. As he pulled into the diner's dirt lot, he spotted the usual assortment of trucks and faded sedans, each one a familiar face attached to a story older than the paint jobs. The bell above the door jingled as Eli stepped inside a gust of warm, greasy air, greeting him like an old friend. Booths were filled with early risers, ranchers, handymen, widows, sharing gossip over mugs of coffee as thick as tar. Margie herself waved from behind the counter, already pouring him a cup without asking. "Mornin', Eli," she said, voice rough but kind. "Mornin', Margie," he replied, tugging his hat respectfully. "Biscuits and gravy if you got 'em." "You know I do." She winked. Eli settled into his usual booth by the window, nodding to a couple of old-timers playing checkers near the pie case. Tyler McCoy, a wiry young man barely out of his teens, slid into the seat across from him. A minute later, his hat was pushed back on his head, and his eyes carried that restless worry Eli recognized all too well in young men eager to fix the world faster than it wanted fixing. "You hear, Mr. Walker?" Tyler asked, lowering his voice like they were trading state secrets. "Developers sniffing around the Hollow Couple ranches already sold." Eli lifted an eyebrow. "Not news. Every year somebody tries." Tyler shook his head. "This time's different. They're serious. New HOA across the highway. Folks say they're making offers. Folks can't refuse. Pushing real hard." Margie dropped off 2 plates, the smell of gravy and fresh-baked biscuits filling the booth. Eli took his time, buttering a biscuit before answering. "This land's been in my family longer than those boys have been wearing boots." "We're not selling." Tyler grunted, but worry pinched his brow. "You know how slick-talking city folks are. Ain't just about selling. They find ways. Paperwork, lawsuits." Eli looked out the window, chewing thoughtfully. Across Main Street, he spotted an unfamiliar SUV, shiny new black like a beetle out of place among the dusty pickups and rusty tractors. Its windows were tinted darker than funeral shades. It idled for a while, then pulled away slowly like a hawk, circling too high to see just yet, but already measuring the field. "Noted," Eli said, finally washing down his bite with black coffee. "We'll keep our eyes open." The rest of breakfast passed in slow conversation, bits of news traded like coins. Miss Ada's pie recipes, Old Man Harrow's new fence, talk of rain that might or might not come before the cold set in. Small things that knitted the town together like a quilt passed down through generations. Later that afternoon, Eli returned to the ranch, the golden light of the setting sun pouring over the fields like warm syrup. He spent the next few hours fixing a loose fence post by the cattle pen, his dog Jasper trotting alongside, ears twitching at every sound. For a while it felt like any other day in Sagebrush Hollow, steady, stubborn, unchanged. until it didn't. At sunset, a sleek black SUV rolled up to Eli's gate. An uninvited guest steps out. A woman in high heels and a tailored suit approaches the porch, thick folder in hand. Victoria Hale's heels snapped against the gravel as she waved a thick folder declaring, "You're trespassing on my property." Her voice cracked like a whip across the dusty yard. Shattering the quiet of the late afternoon, Eli Walker didn't move from his spot on the porch. He stayed seated, elbows resting on his knees, gazing at her with the same unshakable patience he used on skittish calves and stubborn mules. The sun had dipped low enough to paint the fields in long shadows, turning the world a deep, dusky gold. A light breeze stirred the dry grass, but the air between Eli and Victoria was heavy, thick with something that smelled a lot like trouble. She was a sharp contrast to the land around her, all polished steel and city slick striding forward, as if she could pave over 120 years of history with a wave of her manicured hand. "Bought it fair and square through the Homeowners Association expansion project," she said, thrusting the folder toward him like a sword. "Filed paperwork, closing documents, legal notices. You're in violation by refusing to vacate." Eli stood slowly, letting his full height settle into the space between them. He took the offered folder with deliberate calm, flipping through the pages without really reading. His gut had already told him everything he needed to know. Papers could be forged. Deals could be whispered in back rooms, but land remembered who it belonged to. He handed the folder back without a word. "This ranch was deeded to my great-granddaddy in 1903, he said, voice even but edged with iron. "Same deeds in my safe right now. This land ain't under any HOA jurisdiction, never has been. You and whatever paper you're waving, don't change that." Victoria's smile tightened into something brittle. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket, the expensive fabric catching the dying light. "You can either sign a voluntary transfer today," she said, lips curving in a mockery of kindness, "or we'll escalate. I have buyers lined up, developers waiting. There's no sense fighting the inevitable, Mr. Walker." Eli looked past her to the old oak tree that had shaded 5 generations of Walkers. He thought of his grandfather planting it back when Sagebrush Hollow was just a name scribbled on a cattle route map. Thought of the countless sunrises he'd seen from this very porch. There was no inevitable about it, there was only choice, and he'd already made his "I'm not going anywhere," he said simply. A car rumbled by on the main road, an old sheriff's cruiser with a dented fender. Deputy Don Carter slowed as he passed, his eyes flickering between Eli and Victoria. His hand twitched near his steering wheel, then settled. He gave a slow nod, the kind that said he saw what was brewing but wouldn't step in until it boiled over. Then the cruiser rolled on, dust curling behind it. Victoria's nostrils flared slightly. "You'll regret this stubbornness," she hissed. "We have legal remedies, powerful ones." "Maybe," Eli said, voice soft as worn leather. "But you're on my land now. I suggest you get off it." The words hung between them for a long moment. Finally, with a sharp pivot of her heel, Victoria marched back to her sleek black SUV gravel, spit up under her tires as she sped off, the setting sun flashing off her tinted windows like a mirror closing over a bad memory. Eli watched until the dust settled, then picked up the thick folder she'd left behind, flipping it open with a heavy sigh. Fake closing statements. Forged signatures. HOA logos slapped on like cheap stickers trying to make something real out of a lie. He tucked the folder under his arm and headed inside. The house smelled like cedar and old coffee, grounding him as he moved through the familiar rooms. In the study, he knelt before the heavy oak safe, spun the combination, and opened it with a click. Inside, the real deed lay tucked in a plastic sleeve yellowed with age, but strong as ever. He placed Victoria's fake documents right beside it, locking both away, evidence-proof memory. Outside, twilight deepened into full dark. Eli lit a lamp by the window and sat for a while, staring out across the ranch. His mind drifted back to the diner that morning, to the worried looks, the murmured rumors. He'd brushed them off too easily. Change was no longer a rumor. It was here, pounding on the gates. Jasper whined low by the door, ears perked. Eli rose slowly, setting his coffee aside. He grabbed the old flashlight from the hall table, the one with the duct-taped handle, and stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool thick with the scent of earth cooling after a hot day. He swept the beam across the fields, the barns, the gravel drive, nothing but long shadows and cricket song. He turned to scan the fence line and froze. That night, Eli spots flashlights flickering beyond his fence. Under cover of darkness, two strangers snuck past the fences meant to keep evil at bay. The chill of the night hung low across Walker Ranch. Stars, strewn thick as salt across the black sky. Somewhere far off, an owl hooted its call, slicing through the otherwise perfect stillness. Eli Walker sat by the window, the lamp turned low. The day's confrontation with Victoria Hale still burned in his mind, but it was an old lesson that kept ringing louder. Good fences only keep out honest folks. His eyes scanned the horizon, restless. Something was wrong. Jasper, lying at Eli's feet, let out a soft growl, almost a whisper. Eli's hand moved slowly toward the flashlight on the table, then to the old handheld camcorder he kept charged for just such nights. When he stepped onto the porch, the air was sharp against his skin. Carrying the scent of dry earth and hay, he moved with the deliberate quiet of a man who knew his land like the back of his weathered hands. Past the cattle pens near the barn, he caught at a sliver of movement, a flash of pale skin in the moonlight. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply flipped on the flashlight and eased toward the barn steps. Careful, steady. A few yards from the fence, he spotted them. Two figures crouched near the side door, working with crowbars against the old lock. Tyler McCoy, who had been finishing a late check on the livestock, appeared from the other side flashlight beam, bouncing wildly. "Hey!" He called out the word, more instinct than strategy. The strangers turned quick. One of them, thick-set and moving with the raw energy of a cornered dog, grabbed Tyler by the collar, giving him a hard shove that sent him stumbling back into the fence. Wood groaned and snapped under the impact, and Tyler hit the dirt with a grunt, stunned but not broken. Eli tightened his grip on the flashlight. He clicked on the camcorder red light, blinking like a heartbeat, and raised his voice firm but calm. "You're trespassing," he said, loud enough to carry, but without a hint of fear. "You're being recorded. Let go of the boy and get off my land." The thugs froze, unsure. They hadn't expected quiet strength. They hadn't expected evidence. One of them muttered something Eli didn't catch, but it didn't matter. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the thick-set man released Tyler, who scrambled back to his feet, favoring his ribs, but otherwise standing strong. Jasper barked once, sharp and angry from the porch. Eli didn't lower the camcorder, even when the men backed away. "Leave now," he said, voice steady as bedrock, "or the next face you see will be the sheriff's." Panic flickered across the thinner man's face. He tugged at his partner's sleeve, and together they bolted, kicking up dust as they ran across the fields. Toward the road, Eli tracked them with the flashlight just long enough to see them vanish into the tree line. He didn't chase. He didn't have to. Instead, he turned back toward the barn, the beam of his flashlight sweeping over the damaged fence and the scuffed dirt where Tyler had fallen. And there, nailed crudely to the side of the barn door, a piece of scrap wood caught the light. Eli approached, jaw tightening. Someone had scrawled jagged black letters with a heavy hand, the paint still fresh and dripping in the cool air. "Sell or else." The words glared back at him like a threat carved into flesh. Eli ripped the board down and dropped it into the dirt. He stood in the moonlight for a long moment, camcorder still recording, letting the weight of the message sink in. No bluff, no accident. This was a warning, a line crossed. Tyler limped up beside him, holding his side but shaking his head stubbornly. His voice came low, raw from dust and fear. "They're not going to stop, are they?" Inspection day arrived, not with a clipboard and smile, but with trucks and a smirk. By late morning, the cloudy sky hung low over Walker Ranch, the kind of heavy gray that pressed down on the fields like a warning. Eli Walker leaned against the porch rail, sipping his second cup of black coffee, the old thermos set nearby like a silent sentry. He watched the caravan rumbling down his driveway, a line of shiny black SUVs and boxy utility trucks, tires spitting gravel in impatient bursts. Victoria Hale led the procession like a general riding into battle, her tailored suit, crisp heels stabbing into the dirt with every determined step. Behind her, men and women in cheap polo shirts bearing fabricated HOA logos fanned out, armed with clipboards, cameras, and measuring wheels. Jasper growled low from the porch steps, ears flattening. Eli set his cup down with the careful patience of a man who knew that rage served nothing when the enemy wanted a show. He lifted his camcorder charged steady and clicked it on the little red light blinking like a heartbeat. In his other hand, tucked under one arm, was the battered copy of the Texas trespassing statutes he dug out the night before Victoria marched up to the gate without waiting for an invitation. One of her lackeys tried the latch. It rattled, but held firm. "We're here to conduct an inspection," Victoria declared loudly enough for the fields to hear. Eli said nothing at first. He let the camcorder hum softly in the quiet. Then, slowly and deliberately, he lifted the old law book and began reading a loud voice as even as the horizon, "This is private property." He said, "Entry without owner consent constitutes criminal trespass under Texas Penal Code Section 30-5. Some of the inspectors shifted uncomfortably, but most wore smirks, treating it like a game. A woman with oversized sunglasses snapped pictures of the barn. Another man pulled a measuring tape across a flower bed, trampling the late-blooming mums without a second glance. Eli filmed it all. At the far edge of the driveway, tires crunched again. Deputy Don Carter's cruiser pulled up slow, the engine idling as Carter climbed out. Thumbs hooked in his belt loops, he didn't move to stop anything. Just watched face, unreadable. Under the brim of his hat, Eli kept reading. "No agent, regardless of alleged authority, is permitted to bypass posted warnings without express consent of the owner." Victoria crossed her arms, jaw clenching. "We have legal right," she snapped, though her voice wobbled just slightly at the edges. Eli said nothing, letting the silence stretch until it frayed nerves. He trained the camcorder on the man stomping across his vegetable patch, on the clipboard woman counting fence posts on the battered SUVs blocking the drive. "You're building a case," Carter said quietly, stepping close enough for Eli to hear, but not so loud that Victoria's minions would catch it. Eli nodded once without taking his eyes off the scene, his heart beat steady in his chest. He could feel the weight of every old lesson he had learned: patience, documentation, refusal to escalate. Victoria, sensing her grand spectacle unraveling into something dull and legally damning, lost her composure. "You can't hide behind old papers and stubbornness forever," she shouted, stepping closer to the porch. "You're a relic. You don't belong here anymore." Jasper barked sharply at the raised voice, but Eli remained still. He didn't flinch. Didn't answer, only filmed. Across the road, a few of the neighbors had gathered, leaning against their own fences, arms folded, hats low against the wind. Word traveled fast in Sagebrush Hollow, faster than a radio broadcast on a clear night. Mr. Alvarez, from the southern property line, stood next to Miss Lillian from the feed store, both silent witnesses to the slow boiling of Victoria's plan. Some of Victoria's inspectors began to falter, exchanging glances as the situation lost its scripted shine. One of them kicked a loose rock, scuffing up a bed of asters, and Eli's camera caught it all. Then, as if summoned by the growing tension, a deep rumble rolled across the plains. The wind picked up, tugging at Victoria's blazer and tossing leaves across the yard. The first fat drops of rain splattered on the dusty ground. Thunder rumbles, a literal and figurative storm is coming. Some fights are won with fists, others with a 2,000-pound bull and a very unlucky SUV. The morning broke uneasy over Walker Ranch, the air heavy with leftover moisture from the night's distant storms. Eli Walker stood by the corral hat, tipped low against the rising sun, as he listened to the grumble of engines on the road beyond. He knew the sound too well by now: polished tires, city-bought rumble, not the rough clatter of farm trucks. By the time he reached the front gate, the convoy was already rolling in like they owned the place. Black SUVs, rented moving vans, a handful of men and women in crisp polos barking orders like they were running a shipping yard. And there at the front, as always, Victoria Hale in her sharp heels and sharper expression. Clipboard in hand, like a queen, surveying her soon-to-be subjects. Eli didn't bother greeting them. He simply lifted his camcorder, the little red light blinking to life once again. Beside him, Tyler McCoy shifted uneasily, boots scuffing against the gravel. Jasper let out a soft, distrustful growl from the porch. Victoria barked something about inventory checks and liquidating unregistered assets, her voice slicing through the open yard. Without waiting for acknowledgement, her crew fanned out, snapping photos of the barn, measuring fences, poking around the chicken coops like the place was already theirs. Eli said nothing. He filmed it all. It was the clanging gate by the cattle pens that triggered the real trouble. One of Victoria's agents, clipboard swinging from his wrist, slammed the metal latch hard against the fence post. The cattle, already wary from the noise and strange scents, stirred nervously. At the center of the herd stood Tank, all 2,000 pounds of stubborn horned muscle and old soul, eyeing the newcomers with growing displeasure. Eli had warned folks before: nothing moves, Tank, unless he wants to. Today, Tank very much did not want to be moved. Another loud clang, a sharp whistle from one of the men trying to herd cows like they were dogs, and the simmering herd broke. A flash of white-hot chaos ripped across the pens as hooves thundered and dust billowed into the morning sky. Tyler scrambled backward, nearly losing his hat. Cattle charged through the opened gate, pouring into the driveway like a living flood. And in the middle of it, Tank spotted something that didn't belong. Victoria's shiny black SUV, polished to a mirror gleam, parked right at the edge of the gravel. Tank lowered his massive head. Eli lifted the camcorder higher. Without hesitation, Tank charged hooves, gouging deep ruts into the dirt, nostrils flaring. Victoria's crew barely had time to scatter, dropping clipboards and cameras in their wake. The sound of impact carried clear across the fields, a deep, resonant whump, as Tank's shoulders smashed into the side of the SUV, crumpling metal like paper. The vehicle rocked violently, alarms blaring in panicked protest. Another charge, and the front fender peeled away, dangling like a snapped wishbone. Eli, without missing a beat, spoke calmly into the camcorder microphone, documenting unavoidable livestock incident for insurance purposes. He said, voice dry as desert sand. Tyler, coughing in the dust beside him, choked on a laugh. Victoria screeched from somewhere near the porch. Mud splattered up her designer slacks, hair wild, waving her arms like she could command the universe to rewind. She tried to rush forward, only to slip in a puddle left from last night's rain and land hard on her backside, a thick splat of muddy water staining her jacket. Neighbors had started to appear along the fence lines, called by the rising racket. Mr. Alvarez, Miss Lillian, and even old Pastor Jim stood quietly, hats tipped low, arms folded, hiding smirks behind weathered hands. Word of mouth in Sagebrush Hollow traveled faster than wildfire on a dry breeze. Deputy Don Carter arrived a few minutes later, pulling up slow in his cruiser, the siren thankfully silent. He stepped out, took one long look at the scene: the scattered cattle, the wrecked SUV, the mud-soaked Victoria, and pulled a small notepad from his shirt pocket. He began jotting notes in his slow, deliberate scrawl face, impassive. Except for the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth, Victoria shrieked again, struggling to her feet, her hands trembling with fury. Eli calmly trained the camcorder on her silent recording. Everything. Across the field, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of crushed grass and upturned earth. The cattle, now calmed, wandered lazily toward the pastures as if none of it had ever happened. Tank gave the wrecked SUV one final snort of disdain before sauntering off after them, utterly unbothered. Victoria shrieked, muddy and humiliated, as Sheriff Carter quietly jots down notes. Victory bred rage, and rage bred fire. The first hint was a strange crackle, sharp and wrong against the normal night sounds of crickets and rustling leaves. Eli Walker woke with a start, the thick scent of smoke already curling under the old wooden door. For a heartbeat he lay frozen, the heavy blanket of sleep and disbelief holding him down. Then instinct slammed into his body and he was moving, boots jammed on bare feet, shotgun snatched from beside the bed more out of habit than need. He threw open the front door and staggered into the night. The wind howled across the fields, pulling smoke and embers through the sky like angry spirits. Over the rooftop of the barn, flames roared bright and furious, turning the clouds above into a churning sea of orange and black. "No!" Eli breathed. The word ripped from somewhere deep in his chest. He sprinted toward the barn, heart hammering against his ribs. Tyler McCoy was already there, banging open the side pens, coughing against the thick smoke as he herded frightened cattle and horses into the open fields. "Eli!" Tyler shouted hoarsely. "The hayloft! It's too late! She's gone!" Eli didn't answer. He grabbed a loose hose, twisting the spigot hard, but the water sputtered weakly. The pressure too low, the fire too strong. Sparks exploded into the air as beams cracked and collapsed inside the barn. The smell of burning wood oil and something older, something sacred filled the night. He saw a glimpse of Tank through the haze, the old bull charging through a broken fence line toward safety. The other animals, dazed and terrified, scattered into the darkness. Eli coughed, stumbling back, shielding his face from the searing heat. It was no use. No water, no bucket line, no prayers would save the barn now. Lights flickered down the road, headlights bouncing across the ruts. Sheriff's deputies pulled up fast tires, skidding on loose gravel. Deputy Carter was the first out, barking orders to his men, faces grim in the red glow. "Eli!" Carter shouted. "Everyone, clear back! Get away from it! Roof's about to give!" A second later, the barn groaned like a wounded beast. The great ridgepole buckled and the whole structure collapsed inward, sending up a tower of sparks that turned the night sky into a hellish imitation of day. Tyler staggered to Eli's side, smoke-streaked and wide-eyed. "I'm sorry," he rasped. I tried to check the pens before turning in. I should have." Eli clapped a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing once. "This ain't your fault, son," he said, voice rough. "This was coming." A Deputy Carter jogged up, face drawn tight. "We found traces of accelerant, Eli," he said quietly, grim as a funeral bell. "No way this was an accident." Eli nodded slowly. Somewhere deep inside, a small part of him wasn't even surprised. After everything, the forged papers, the fake inspections, the veiled threats, it had only been a matter of time before the war turned from paperwork to matches. Neighbors began trickling in. Drawn by the glow, Mr. Alvarez, Miss Lillian, Pastor Jim. They stood quietly along the fence lines, hats clutched in calloused hands, faces pale in the flickering light. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The barn was gone. The heart of Walker Ranch reduced to blackened ribs and smoking ash. Eli stepped forward, boots sinking into mud and soot. The heat still radiated from the wreckage, curling his skin. He knelt slowly near the ruins, fingers brushing something half-buried under a scorched rafter paper. He pulled it free carefully, and his stomach twisted. A half-burnt eviction notice charred around the edges but still legible enough to recognize the signature scrawled across the bottom, Victoria Hale. The paper crumbled to ash in his hand, the last thread of mercy with it. For a long moment, Eli simply knelt there. The wind tossing smoke around him, the ruins of generations smoldering at his feet. He thought of his grandfather pounding nails with bloodied fingers, of his father hauling stubborn cattle through storm and drought, of his own calloused hands mending every broken thing. For decades, they had fought for this land, bled for it, and he could not let it be taken now. Slowly, he rose, shoulders squared against the biting wind, gaze hardening into something cold and unbreakable. He made no speeches, no promises, only a vow, quiet and binding as bedrock. He would never back down. A single voice can be drowned out. A chorus cannot. The sun rose heavy over Sagebrush Hollow, painting the dirt roads and weathered rooftops with a soft golden light. It was the kind of morning that usually promised another slow, peaceful day, in a town too stubborn for change. But today something different brewed beneath the surface, a quiet vibration like cattle sensing a coming storm. At the Sagebrush Diner, every chair was filled. Boots scuffed against worn linoleum floors. Coffee cups steamed in every hand. Conversation buzzed low, tense, expectant. Eli Walker stood at the front, hat in one hand, camcorder in the other. Beside him, Tyler McCoy sat stiff-backed, bruises faded but still tender, reminders of how far things had gone. Sheriff Don Carter leaned against the counter, silent but present, a steady anchor. If things spun out of hand, Eli cleared his throat, the low rumble pulling every eye toward him. "I reckon most of you have heard about the fire," he began, voice plain and even, "or seen what's left of the barn." A few murmurs of assent rippled through the room. Miss Lillian dabbed at her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Mr. Alvarez sat stone-faced, arms crossed tight over his chest. Eli lifted the camcorder and set it on the counter, rewinding to the footage he had gathered: trespassers stomping flower beds, tank demolishing the SUV, Victoria's forged eviction notice now charred but documented in photographs. "Wasn't an accident," he said, "wasn't a misunderstanding. It's a campaign to run folks like me off this land." Silence pressed down heavy. Folks shuffled in their chairs. A waitress refilled cups by rote hand, shaking just slightly. Eli scanned the faces: old ranchers who'd mended the same fences year after year, veterans who'd buried too many friends overseas, diner owners who remembered when coffee cost a nickel. These people weren't just neighbors, they were threads in the same worn, stubborn quilt. "My granddaddy used to say," Eli went on, "when wolves circle, the herd stands shoulder to shoulder." Across the room, something shifted. A few nods, a few hats lowered and raised again in silent agreement. Tyler stood too surprising Eli. His voice cracked, but carried, "They're not just coming for him. They're coming for all of us. Our homes. Our way of life." Pastor Jim stood next, one weathered hand gripping the edge of the table. "I built my church with these hands. I'll be damned if I watch them bulldoze it for a parking lot." One by one, others followed. Words weren't needed anymore. A ripple of agreement ran through the diner like a rising wind. Sheriff Carter finally pushed off the counter, adjusting his belt with a deliberate tug. "Officially," he said, "this here's private property disputes. Not much the department can do unless things turn ugly." He paused, letting that sink in. "But unofficially," he added, voice dropping to a low drawl, "this town's been here long before any developer had fancy dreams. And sometimes it's up to the town to remind 'em." Chairs scraped back as folks rose, a wave of boots and denim. Plans formed: quick, simple, and strong trucks would line Walker Ranch's perimeter. A solid wall of iron, and Will families would bring flags, chairs, coolers, as old-timers would sit in folding chairs with thermoses of sweet tea and a silent, immovable stare. By late afternoon, the ranch was a fortress without walls. Pickup trucks backed against the fence line, tailgates down, American flags snapping in the rising breeze. Kids ran laughing between the rows, tossing a half-deflated football. Miss Lillian handed out sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Mr. Alvarez checked and rechecked the lineup, measuring the distance between trucks with a surveyor's eye. Eli walked among them, heart heavier than ever before. But steadied by the sight, Tyler moved beside him, limping slightly but grinning wide. "You think they'll come?" Tyler asked. Watching a group of teenagers tie banners between two old oaks, Eli squinted toward the horizon, where a cloud of dust rose along the highway. "They're coming," he said quietly. Engines rumbled louder as a convoy of black SUVs and sleek sedans rolled into view, a dark river cutting through the golden light. They slowed at the end of the driveway, confusion flickering through their tinted windows at the wall of trucks, flags, and steel-jawed townsfolk. The lead SUV door opened. Victoria Hale stepped out, heels sinking into the dirt clipboard forgotten in her hand. Victoria steps out of her SUV, stunned at the wall of defiance. You can bulldoze a fence, but not a soul rooted to the land. Under the clear October sun, the front fields of Walker Ranch gleamed like fresh-turned gold. Harvest Festival banners fluttered against the deep blue sky, their bright colors snapping in the crisp breeze. It should have been just another festival day with pie contests and fiddlers tuning up on the church steps. But today the town had gathered for something else entirely, something heavier than celebration and sweeter than revenge. Eli Walker stood at the edge of the crowd, boots planted firm in the churned earth. Tyler McCoy, a solid presence at his side. Trucks lined the ranch fence. Kids swung from hay bales, and neighbors leaned against tailgates with arms crossed, watching, waiting. Down the long, dusty drive, Victoria Hale approached a slim figure cutting against the wide Texas horizon. She wore another crisp, white suit, high heels stabbing the dirt with every furious step. Behind her trailed a small band of agents and security guards. Their numbers thinned, and their enthusiasm long since bled away. Victoria clutched a thick folder in one hand, waving it overhead like a white flag twisted into a weapon. "This property has been legally forfeited," she screeched, voice pitching high enough to make the crows flutter from the trees. "I have the court's authority to evict this squatter and seize all assets immediately." Eli didn't move, didn't blink. His hands rested easy at his sides, one thumb hooked through his belt. He caught sight of Deputy Don Carter stepping out from his cruiser, calm as ever, clipboard tucked neatly under one arm. Carter strode forward, giving Victoria a slow, measured look. "Ma'am," he said, voice flat, "this is Walker Ranch. Mr. Walker holds clear, uncontested title. Your documents." He nodded toward her waving folder. "Are forgeries. We've confirmed it through the county clerk's office." Victoria's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a beached fish gasping for water, and Carter continued, flipping open his clipboard with almost lazy precision. "By order of the state attorney's office, you're under arrest for criminal trespassing, fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and suspected arson." A gasp rippled through the crowd, but no one spoke, no one needed to. Two state investigators flanked Carter badges gleaming under the sun. They stepped forward in tandem, hands practiced and efficient as Victoria stumbled backward. Sputtering, "You can't arrest me!" she shrieked. "I'm the victim here. They're the criminals!" She pointed wildly at Eli, at Tyler, at the wall of trucks and weathered faces. "They conspired against me. You're all corrupt. You'll see. You'll all see." But no one moved. No one answered. Eli simply stood there, a quiet mountain of patience, watching as Victoria's empire of slick lies crumbled into dust. Her agents drifted away, faces blank. Phones clutched in limp hands like leaves blown from a dying tree. Even her private security melted back toward their SUVs, unwilling to lift a finger for a woman who had so clearly lost. The investigators cuffed Victoria's hands behind her back. She struggled, cursed, twisted, but there was no audience left to impress. Only a town rooted deeper than any legal loophole, stronger than any false paper could ever tear down. Carter nodded once to Eli, a silent gesture of respect, before leading Victoria to the waiting cruiser. The door thunked closed behind her, muffling her howls into meaningless noise. The dust of her departure settled slow across the field, and the people of Sagebrush Hollow turned back toward their trucks, their families, their lives. Weeks later, the Harvest Festival returned in full bloom. Booths lined the town square, laden with jars of peach preserves and homemade quilts. Kids ran with sticky candy apples in hand, and fiddlers played under the sprawling arms of the town's oldest oak. Out at Walker Ranch, the smell of fresh sawdust and clean hay drifted across the fields. Neighbors came in waves bearing hammers, nails, and strong backs. Together they raised a new barn, higher, stronger, built not just with wood, but with something far harder to break. Loyalty, Tyler hammered the final beam into place, his grin wide and proud. despite the bruises still faint along his ribs. The crowd cheered as the last nail sank home, a joyful thunder rolling across the hills. As the sun dipped low behind the new barn's pitched roof, Eli Walker settled back into his rocking chair on the porch, black coffee steaming in his hand. Jasper lay stretched at his feet. Tail thumping lazily, he rocked slowly, watching the land spread out before him, golden, stubborn, enduring. This was more than a victory. It was home. It always would be. The fields of Walker Ranch stood golden and unbroken, stitched back together, not just with nails and timber, but with the steady hands of a community that refused to yield. In the end, it wasn't loud threats or forged papers that won. It was quiet loyalty, shared history, and the stubborn courage to do what was right. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're twisted for greed, they crumble under their own weight. Maybe it's never too late to stand shoulder to shoulder with neighbors and to remember that even the strongest storms pass when good people hold the line.